Have you ever been confused on where God is leading you? It's like one minute everything's great. There's a job, you're going to church, things are moving fine, everything is moving in seemingly a successful direction, but yet all of a sudden things change. And his leading doesn't seem to make any sense to you. When this happens, there are so many questions that come up, like, why did you change things up on me, God? Why did this thing have to happen? And everything was moving in a positive direction, but Jesus, it's like you're changing up the chessboard on me and I don't understand. If you've ever had one of these confusing things happen to you, I want you to know that you're not alone. My name is JD Goading and this is Understanding the Bible. And the reason that I started this channel was to take small amounts of text and simply mine the gold out of it. I found it so helpful when I started studying the Bible for myself, when someone would come by and just point out a thing or two, and it just helped open up the text in a new way. And that's my goal for you, because I want your relationship with Christ to only improve. And if you wouldn't mind, smash that like and subscribe button. It just helps push this message out further. One place that I felt this kind of confusion was during the COVID years. And I know that everybody can relate to this because we all lived through it. It's like one minute everything was fine, and then the next, it's like jobs were being shut down, churches were being shut down, there was quarantines, there was lockdowns, there was rationing, there was all kinds of things that were happening that most of us are just not used to. One of the funny things that I remember seeing was a crinkled up piece of paper taped to a wall of the local hockey rink that I play at. And it said, like, if you've been to China in the last, however many days, please don't come in. And it had about the same authority as like a wet floor sign that's been there for too long. Like, it was just, someone just kind of printed this thing out, taped it up, and there it was. But needless to say, within 1 month of seeing that sign, the world had completely changed. One of the ways that this hit home deeply for me was how it affected our Bible school. You see, I live in Australia, and COVID was like one of those things that just was part of the news cycle. And then all of a sudden, major airlines were talking about canceling transcontinental flights. And we have students from all over the world. So we had to make a decision very quickly. And the decision was this: we need to stop what we're doing and send everybody home, send all of our students home. So in a span of 48 hours, all of our students went from being in a classroom, everything's normal, to literally getting on airplanes, sometimes the last airplane going back to their nation. Now, after all the adrenaline had run out and we had sent students home, we had sent a bunch of staff members home, what we realized is our base had shrunk by about 80%. And then to go along and comply with all of the COVID rules meant that we were stuck in our homes under lockdown, just like basically all of you. Some of the things that didn't make sense about this was we had high student numbers. We were sending outreaches into all kinds of different locations, and people were being educated in the Bible. And then all of a sudden, all of that just simply shut down. Now, why do I bring this up? The disciples in this story are not dealing with a global pandemic, but the earth under their feet is absolutely shaking. Jesus has now begun to do something different, and this would have been something the disciples would have picked up on. Gone were the days of the big crowds, and it says this: they went on from there and passed through Galilee, and they did not want anyone to know, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered over into the hands of men, and they will kill him, and when he is killed, after 3 days he will be raised. The reason that this is such a radical shift is because normally when Jesus goes through Galilee, there's huge crowds, there's healings that happen, there's all kinds of outward focused ministry. But this time it seems like Jesus is actually trying to hide himself, and he's spending more time with his disciples trying to get their attention. Now, this is a turning point in Jesus' ministry, but doesn't it seem odd to you that he just purposefully keeps himself hidden? Like, he's walking through Galilee and he doesn't want anyone to know who he is. And we have the ability to look back and kind of read the rest of the story. But what Jesus is doing is he is preparing himself for going to the cross. He's preparing his disciples for going to the cross. And this is a big deal. Instead of focusing on the crowds, he's focusing on his disciples because he knows that things are going to be changing very quickly, very soon. And one of the things that the disciples would have to reconcile was how Daniel, the prophet Daniel, speaks of the Son of Man, and then how Jesus speaks of the Son of Man. Because to them, these two things cannot coexist. In Daniel 7, it says, I saw the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which should not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. The disciples would have been asking themselves, how does this everlasting kingdom and dominion talk square with being executed? Like that doesn't make sense to the disciples. If I'm honest and I'm really putting myself in the shoes of the disciples, one of the emotions that's coming up is just straight confusion because this does not make sense. But they did not understand the saying and were afraid to ask him. One of the good questions to ask here is, what were they afraid of? Were they afraid that Jesus was going to give them a harsh scolding? Or were they afraid that their ignorance, because Jesus, let's face it, he's already talked about this once, that they're just not getting it? Or maybe, is there like an intensity in Jesus as he's walking towards Jerusalem with every step? The weight of the world is literally on his shoulders. And what Jesus is talking about is very real. So are they feeling that? And the answer to that question is we really don't know, but it's an interesting thought to ponder. And when they came to Capernaum and when he was in the house, he asked them, what were you discussing along the way? Now, as this story unfolds, we kind of can put a few pieces together. One, they've been walking for a long time, so they're probably exhausted. So they come to Capernaum, they come into the house, which is most likely Peter's house. And if you remember back in chapter 1, when Jesus walks into Peter's house and Peter's mother-in-law is laid out on the bed because she's so sick with a fever, Jesus gently picked her up by the hand, the fever left, and the woman started to serve Jesus. That's probably the house that they've come to for this teaching. And I will say that getting the Daniel passage and then what Jesus is saying to a place of understanding is something that would have been really, really hard and kind of like a mind bender for them. But what you're going to realize in just a second is they were completely caught up in themselves. Jesus had been teaching them all along the way that this was going to happen. He had been explaining that he would be handed over into the hands of men, that he would be crucified, and then that he would be raised from the dead. But you see, they weren't listening to Jesus. They were simply having side conversations as this journey was happening, and what Jesus was saying was actually falling on deaf ears. So when Jesus hits them with the question, hey, what were you guys talking about along the way? You can see why all of a sudden nobody wants to say anything. But they kept silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. And it's right here where the real problem comes into play. And the problem is they were discussing among themselves who is going to be the greatest in Jesus' kingdom. They were still thinking about Jesus making a physical kingdom, and yet Jesus isn't talking about that. He's talking about a spiritual kingdom. And so their hopes of being in Jesus' royal court or Jesus' royal cabinet, those hopes and dreams have just been dashed to pieces. And he sat them down and called the 12, and he said to them, if anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all. Now there's something very significant, but yet very small that I want you to see here, because when Jesus calls the 12, that word called is the same word that's used in Mark 1:26 when the demon is cast out. Let me show you. And the unclean spirit convulsing him and crying out with a loud voice came out of him. Now, this is one of the demonic encounters that Jesus had earlier in the book, but the word called is the same word that Jesus uses to call the disciples to sit down and listen. It's the same word that is used when the demon is convulsing in the man and crying out. So what does that tell you? Well, it tells you this little powwow that Jesus is having with the disciples doesn't seem to be like a gentle discussion. It seems like Jesus is being very forceful and probably raising his voice at the disciples to get their attention. Jesus was teaching about how he was going to die and how he was going to be raised again, and they're talking about who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom. The stupidity of the disciples in this moment is just simply legendary. But what Jesus is saying here is this: if anyone would be first, he must be last and a servant of all. So the question is, what does that mean? Well, if there's a first, that means there's a second and a third, and eventually there has to be a last. And so you can imagine the arguments that the disciples would have been having with one another. You can imagine Peter standing up and say, well, Jesus chose me first. Look at how good I am. You can imagine James standing up and say, hey, I was at the Mount of Transfiguration. I saw Moses and Elijah. Did you guys get to see that? No. And then you can see Matthew standing up and saying, guys, do you have any idea how much money I've lost in following Jesus? And yet each one of these reasons that they would have been arguing about are completely meaningless in the scope of what Jesus is talking about. The entire journey that they had just come off of had just been a complete exercise in stupidity. Jesus had just been teaching how he was going to be given over to the hands of men. He was going to be executed, and then he would be raised from the dead. And his disciples are only talking about who's going to be the greatest? Can you think of a more disrespectful group of people? Now, fortunately, Jesus never leaves the disciples in the dark, no matter how stupid or foolish they come across. And he's also the master of communication. So watch what he does right here. And he took a child and put him in the midst of them. And taking him in his arms, he said to them, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives not only me, but him who sent me. Whose child is this, and where does this little guy come from? We don't know. But what we do know is the kid shows up at the perfect time, and Jesus scoops him up and puts him on his lap. And Jesus says, whoever, meaning you disciples, receives a child in my name receives me. The problem was the disciples were acting childish, and they were completely missing the boat on what Jesus was calling them into. When someone receives a child, they're not receiving a higher position or a promotion. It's actually the opposite. You see, the only thing someone can do for a child is serve them without any hope of a transactional relationship. I mean, let's face it. You have a little kid, and he's sitting in the high chair, and what do? You scoop out a thing of peas, and you put it in his mouth. And the little kid looks at you, half of it gets swallowed, and the other half comes out, usually all over the parent, right? And so what's the job of the parent? Continue feeding the child until it's done. Clean him up, take him out of the high chair, change his diaper, give him a bath, put him to bed, and then you know what? You wake up the next day and you do it all over again. In other words, being a servant is a thankless position, but yet that is exactly what Jesus is calling us into. Jesus wants us to be servants in his name, meaning everything we do is for Jesus. And our goal is not for personal gain or higher position or for a promotion. So after our school had sent everybody home, we had a dilemma on our hands. How do we manage the situation? Well, strategically, what we did is we made small teachings, put them on YouTube, and then gave them to the students, and the students would email us back their work so that they could graduate. But during that time, we were watching our ministry shrink by 80%, and that was a hard pill to swallow. And what I realized from that is much of what I was doing was being done out of personal gain. Basically, I was looking at the numbers of our students. I was looking at how many Bible teachings I was able to do. I was looking at the things that I was doing in my own strength, and what I realized is I was completely out of line. Even more, I was out of line, and I didn't even know it until it was revealed to me through the COVID experience. And this is something that I had to come to grips with, because if I'm going to serve Jesus truthfully, if I'm going to serve Jesus honestly, then wherever I find myself, that's what I need to be doing, is serving. So if Jesus takes the school away from me, well, okay, I still need to serve in the capacity that Jesus has me. And the thing is, sometimes Jesus will bring you into places, and he will bring you into seasons where you are maybe in charge. You're the one that's leading the show. And then in the next season, you're seemingly sitting on the bench. You see, Jesus isn't calling us to be in strong positions. He's calling us to serve, and serving is tough. Because when you're sitting there with your little guy and you're tired at night and you're feeding him that bowl of peas, what often happens is that bowl of peas gets dumped on the floor, or that bowl of peas gets spit out all over you. And what becomes of that? It's in the middle of that experience where you still love your child, where you still pick him up and you hold him and you hear him cry and you put him down at night. And like I said earlier, the next day you do it all over again. That's what the Christian life is like. And for those of us that call ourselves Christians, this is the attitude we need to assume all the time. I'm not saying this is easy by any means. And actually what I'm saying is there's probably a lot of heart surgery that needs to happen in both you and me as we kind of walk forward in our Christian life. Jesus is always cutting out those cancerous parts inside of us because selfishness is so easy. But what Jesus calls us to is to be servants. And being servants means we're not looking for the promotion. We're not looking for the recognition. We're just doing the job in Jesus' name with him looking down on us, being pleased. That needs to be enough. The more you serve in Jesus' name, the more you honor God as a Christian. Let me give you a practical example. Several weeks ago, I was in Lima, Peru, specifically in the slums, and I was teaching in a Bible school. The ministry that I was working with was called Lost Children of Peru. It was started by a man named Larry Good, who had a real desire in his heart for the children in this area. His son Kevin had asked me to come down and speak, and of course I said yes. I'll leave their link in the bio below. They are an incredible organization that is spreading the love of Jesus to the poorest of the poor. While I was there, I witnessed poverty on a large scale. Many of the people have dirt floors, like literally in their house. Their roofs are nothing but tin, and there's kids absolutely everywhere. As I began to teach that week, the students were absolutely incredible. And one of them was a 25-year-old guy named Mickey who could never stop smiling. Every time you saw this guy, he had this huge smile. And while we were in class, he asked compelling questions, he took incredible notes, and he's the kind of guy that you just dream of having as a teacher. But the thing that impressed me most about Mickey was that he was doing this Bible school on top of his normal job. And his normal job was taking care of all of these kids. These kids would come to the center where they would sing songs, they would play games, they would hear teachings about Jesus, there would be a service every night, there was real intense worship, and this is what Mickey was charged with doing. Does Mickey hold a high position? No. Is Mickey doing exactly what Jesus has called us to do? Absolutely. And even though I was the teacher that week, I learned more about what it meant to really love children as Jesus loved children because of people like Larry, Kevin, and Mickey. Jesus said, "Whoever receives one such child in my name receives me." Now, my friends Larry, Kevin, and Mickey, those men are doing exactly what Jesus had commanded. I'm a better person for going down there, and they're an example for all of us of what it looks like to serve and obey the words of Jesus. Thanks, and I hope this helps.